書いてある。書いてない。これ秒算の方が近いね、きっとね。これ今持ってきたの。
To outfight him. And it's tactics and strategy, not overwhelming firepower, that causes the U.S.
オーバーウェルム圧倒する。
To ultimately lose the war in Vietnam, a loss that Sun Tzu predicted thousands of years earlier. How Sun Tzu was able to do this, as well as predict the outcome of the invasion of Normandy and the final harrowing day of battle at Gettysburg.
これヘロインでちょっとわかんないね。ヘロインデイって言ってるよね。こんな時間あんのかな。ヘロインはヘロインだよね。その時間なくないね。ちょっと意味がちょっとわかんない。
Battle at Gettysburg is about to be revealed. Sun Tzu says, in war, numbers alone confer no advantage.
これ冒頭に説明したと同じですね。In war, numbers alone confer no advantage. confer 与える、アドバンテージ与えない。数が多ければいいと思うんではないと。さっき言ったよね。
Do not advance relying on sheer military power.
全くの軍事力で頼ることはノーアドバンテージ。
It's the mid-1960s in Vietnam. U.S. General William Westmoreland orders intense aerial bomb.
これはですね、別の言い方をして。これはですね、
alone confer no advantage. Sun Tzu says, in war,
number alone confer.
Numbers alone confer no advantage. Do not.
数は
not advance, relying.
Do not advance, relying on sheer military power. これはですね、そういう何言ってるかというと、敵を分断するっていうことを言ってるんですね。それが昨日思ったんだけど、どっかに書いてあるんだよね。まあいいや。数に勝って。
On sheer military power.
倍すれば敵を分かつとかいいじゃないですか。
敵を分かつですよ。
倍すれば。こちらが2倍やったら糸を半分にして分けてさらに有利にしましょう。
そうです。
It's the mid-1960s in Vietnam. U.S. General William Westmoreland orders intense aerial bombardments. The U.S. will eventually drop nearly 7 million tons of bombs on Indochina during the war, more than twice the tonnage of all the bombs dropped by the U.S. in World War II. But the Americans are about to learn Sun Tzu's lesson the hard way, that despite overwhelming military power and the valor of its soldiers, the U.S. cannot win this war.
Between 1959 and 1975, the North Vietnamese fought a very desperate war against the South Vietnamese government and their U.S. allies. And even though they were heavily outgunned, when you look at how the war was fought and see that through Sun Tzu's eyes, it's obvious how they prevailed.
ブリベール、このブリベールは彼らの、もうさっきはなんか勝つって言ってましたよね。広く行えれるっていう意味なんですよね。打ち勝つって。これはでもそういう意味かな。
Uses a chess-inspired strategy. Stop the communist spread by killing as many North Vietnamese and Viet Cong as possible. Conversely, Westmoreland's adversary, the North Vietnamese general Vo Nguyen Giap, uses more of a Sun Tzu Go strategy.
Westmoreland is trying to attrit the enemy, trying to kill as many as possible. Giap, meanwhile, is looking at it from more of a go perspective, trying to focus on how do I win as much territory as possible and thus defeat my enemy.
To combat the American aerial bombardment, Giap looks to a key Sun Tzu principle. Know your enemy and know yourself, and in 100 battles you will never be in peril.
The way the Americans often operated was somewhat predictable. They would prepare a landing zone through artillery strikes and airstrikes, and then they would bring the troops in. Giap recognized this and realized that if he could have it,
これジャップっていうのは暴言ザップのこと。
his troops hunker down and survive the
ハンカーってハンカーダウンです。腰を据えてかかる。
artillery attacks, then when the troops landed, they would be able to set up ambushes to take them on.
北仏なのね。腰を据えて構える。
The American bombs don't destroy the enemy. They merely telegraph that the
テレグラフっていうのはテレグラフ電信で教えるテレグラフ。
US infantry is on its way.
インファントリーは歩兵部隊ね。
Giap also orders his fighters to stay as close to American soldiers as possible.
Viet Cong have no tactical air. They also understand that once their positions get identified in a given battle, they're going to get whacked from the air. So how do you
get whack 強く打つ叩く whack
compensate for that? Well, General Giap said you grab the enemy by the belt. Put another way, what you want to
grab the enemy by the belt 敵のベルトを掴む
do is you don't want to establish positions out there, and when they did defensively, for example, like at Hamburger Hill, you know, wham!
ハンバーガーヒルってこれはですね1987年にアメリカの合衆国映画で1969年南ベトナムのアシャウ渓谷にある丘でドンアップビア通称937高地でアメリカ軍第101空挺師団と北ベトナム軍との間で繰り広げられた攻防戦ハンバーガーヒル
They get hit by lots of air. But if you're in a tactical situation, you close with the enemy. You intermingle your forces with his.
インターミングルって混ざり合う交互に工作した
So they can't bring air power to bear without hurting their own troops.
Free from U.S. bombs, Giap launches Sun Tzu-inspired guerrilla attacks against Americans on the ground. Ambushes, hand grenade booby traps.
ブービートラップってなんかあれですねなんかこれ書いてないけど
罠ですよ
そうあ、これ書いてないね、ブービートラップ。ブービートラップって罠。これ出てるかな 出てた。偽装爆弾。偽装爆弾。
Snipers.
スナイパー狙撃兵。
What Jap starts to do is close in harassing raids against the Americans. And Sun Tzu likes this idea because by forcing the enemy to maneuver, to respond to you, he reveals strengths and weaknesses. And the more you know about his strengths and weaknesses, the more you can avoid the strengths and attack and exploit the weaknesses.
The major U.S. weakness in this war is not on the battlefield.
Now, our weakness was not in Vietnam. We never lost anything in Vietnam. We lost no engagements in Vietnam. But we did lose in the resolution of the American people to pursue the war. Jap realized this from the very start, and he did not try to defeat us in Vietnam. He tried to defeat us in the United States.
Giap knows that if he can turn the American people against the war, he can defeat the overpowering U.S. military. In the beginning of the war, nearly 80% of Americans supported the military action in Vietnam. Between 1965 and 1967, President Johnson increases troop strength dramatically from 190,000 to almost 500,000. But more soldiers means more casualties.
Between 1959 and 1965, the U.S. had suffered 2,000 battle deaths. But then in 1966, it jumped to 6,000, and then in 1967, it jumped to 11,000. And this was because Westmoreland was enacting an attrition-based strategy.
やんなくていいんだって実行する、実施するっていう。どこにあるか。ニュートリションってこれあれかな。栄養失調じゃなかったかな。ニュートリションって栄養失調。
栄養とかで意味じゃないですか。栄養とか意味じゃなくて。
栄養摂取。どういう意味かな、これ。栄養補給。ニュートリション、栄養補給。でもなんで時短が違うんだろうね。
MSB でしょ。
これなんかそうやってエナクティングって意味違うのか
な。今月で角田さんが来ない。
なんかあの人さっき忙しいみたい、ヨットで週末、これエナクトってさ法制化するって意味なんだよね。エナクト法律を制定する。ニュートリションじゃないんだよね、きっとね。なんか時短年間おかしいな。これなんかおかしいな。認知症になっちゃう。 nutrition じゃないね。これなんだろう。
And this was because Westmoreland was enacting an attrition-based strategy.
違うね。アトリッションって言って。アトリッションか。そんなのあった。消耗戦か。ニュートリションじゃないな、これ。ちょっとわかんないな。
Strategy. He wanted to take the battle to the North Vietnamese and try to kill as many of their soldiers as possible. And of course,
やっぱアトリッションの消耗だね、きっと。よくわかんない。
this led to higher casualties among the Americans.
Ignoring the rising death toll and the potential political backlash, Westmoreland persists
バックラッシュって反動ですね。
with his chess-like strategy.
One does not win wars by winning battles. That's a very archaic concept. The Romans
アーカイクコンセプト、アーカイク。旧式の時代遅れの。
learned this. They fought for 40 years in Spain. They fought for 30 years in England and still couldn't subdue the insurgencies.
サブデューっていうのは何だっけ。鎮圧する。こういうことだ。
Battles and military operations are nothing more than means to an end, means to the achievement of strategic goals.
だから戦略的に目標を達成するのが目的で、
then means to an end, means to the
終わりにするんじゃなくて目標を達成する。
achievement of
で彼言ってるの目標がない。
strategic goals. Okay, those goals, by the way, are often political. What often happens to military men is they, as we used to say in the army, you dance with who brung you. They're military guys. They got one trick. Their trick is war. Okay, and what happens, and happens to us now, is that essentially the war and the battles become an end in itself without any consideration of whether or not it leads to the ultimate strategic
Whether or not to lead to the ultimate
goal
strategic goal.
of breaking the will of the enemy.
But no matter how bloody the battlefield gets, the Vietnamese will is never broken.
これあれだね、ベトナム戦争の場合はベトナム will is never broken.
Giap famously claims he's willing to lose 10 men for every one American. Many North Vietnamese troops wear a tattoo that says, "Born in the North, to die in the South." And it's this difference that Giap knows will allow him to defeat the Americans, who now have more than 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam, many of whom don't want to be there.
Believe me, all conscripts want to
All conscript 徴集兵。
do is get the hell out of country. You know, everybody arrives with what we call their DEROS date, date of expected return overseas. You know, scratch somewhere, you crush your forehead, this is when I get to go home. And it's very hard to train them to do the kinds of stuff that Special Operations Forces have to do in order to fight an insurgency. So you put it all together, and it's a failure of strategic thinking, a failure to appreciate the cultural context in which things occurred, and inevitably deduce from that a failure to develop
deduce from that 推論する inevitably 避けがたいっていうのは inevitably 推論する deduce from that failure to develop tactics 当然と inevitably 当然としてかな自然的に inevitably 自然的にこの理解ちゃんと変わってくれたね
tactics that are effective.
To combat Giap's guerrilla insurgency, Westmoreland launches search and destroy missions throughout South Vietnam. He believes he is successfully rooting out Giap's Viet Cong
ルーティングアウトとルートアウト根絶する。
insurgents. But a Pentagon report released after the war shows just how wrong he actually was.
What it found was that in more than 80% of the cases where American troops fought Viet Cong troops, that in fact it was the enemy that chose the time and place of the ambush. That in point of fact we were not searching and destroying anything. In point of fact, we were not searching and destroying anything. In point of fact, if the enemy didn't want to fight, they just let us stumble on through the bush. But when they wanted to fight, it would pick the time and place.
Giap's guerrilla tactics are working, but his Sun Tzu-inspired strategy is suddenly overruled by his commanding officer.
オーバールールとはね、これはね、無効とするとか、権力を用いて変更する、否定する、無効とする。
He is ordered to plan a full-scale direct offensive against the U.S. forces.
これフルスケールダイレクトオフェンシブ、全面的な直接の攻撃。
Giap knows this is suicide, so instead he modifies the plan. Returning to Sun Tzu's principles, he decides to coordinate a simultaneous multi-pronged attack in hundreds.
Multi-pronged. これはクワだよね。複数のクワのフォークですね。串がある。いくつもの串がある。
Hundreds of different locations across South Vietnam. The date for the attack? January 31st, 1968. Vietnam's Lunar New Year holiday called Tet. Giap has less than 9 months to plan his Tet offensive, a Sun Tzu-inspired strategy that will prove to be a powerful turning point in the war.